On a mist-shrouded morning in the dense forests of Germania, long before the roar of engines or the glare of electric lights, a child was born into a world divided. His name would be remembered not in the golden halls of Rome, but in the silent woods where the Roman eagle was once torn from the sky. That name was Arminius, the warrior who defied the greatest empire of the ancient world. Born around 18 BCE into the Cherusci, a Germanic tribe living along the frontier of the Roman Empire, Arminius was no ordinary boy. His people lived between two worlds, theirs, wild and tribal, and that of Rome, disciplined, urban, and hungry for expansion. To secure peace, or perhaps to forge chains of dependence, Rome took the sons of tribal leaders as hostages, raising them in its cities, shaping their minds, giving them Latin names and Roman educations. Arminius was one of them. In Rome, he learned their language, studied their tactics, wore their armor. He became a Roman citizen, earned the rank of equus, a knight. He fought for Rome in distant campaigns, serving under the Roman general Publius Quinctilius Varus. To the empire, he was the perfect model of assimilation, a barbarian made Roman. But in the heart of Arminius, Germania still burned. By 9 CE, Varus had been appointed governor of the newly conquered province of Germania. He was arrogant, dismissive, and blind to the growing storm. Arminius, now serving as a trusted military advisor, was watching, waiting. He had not forgotten his people. He had not forgotten who he truly was. That year, as summer faded and the legions began to prepare for their return to winter quarters, Arminius set his plan into motion. He spread false reports of rebellion in the countryside. Varus, trusting him implicitly, marched 3 legions, nearly 20,000 men, into the thick, unfamiliar forest known as the Teutoburg Forest. What followed was not a battle, it was annihilation. Rain poured from dark skies. The Roman line, long and vulnerable, wound through muddy paths choked with trees. Suddenly, from the shadows, the Germanic tribes struck, not as scattered warriors, but as a coordinated force united under Arminius's command. They knew the terrain, they knew Roman tactics, they knew fear. For 3 days the Romans were harried, ambushed, surrounded. Arrows whistled from the trees, spears flashed in the gloom. The ground was littered with broken shields and shattered hopes. By the end, nearly every Roman soldier lay dead. Varus, disgraced and broken, fell on his own sword. The eagles of the 3 legions, symbols of Roman might, were taken as trophies. When news of the disaster reached Rome, it is said that Emperor Augustus, now an old man, wandered his palace in grief, crying, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." It was a wound Rome never truly healed. Arminius had done the impossible. He had stopped Rome, not in a skirmish, not in a border raid, but in a definitive shattering blow that halted Roman expansion into Germania permanently. The empire would never again try to conquer the Germanic lands east of the Rhine, but victory did not bring peace. Arminius tried to unite the Germanic tribes into a lasting confederation to forge a new power from the ashes of Roman ambition. But the same independence that made his people fierce also made them resistant to rule, even by their liberator. He faced betrayal, rebellion, and growing distrust. In 21 CE, he was assassinated by members of his own tribe, his wife taken by a rival chief, his dream of a united Germania buried beside him. Rome celebrated his death, but they never forgot his name. Centuries later, his legend would rise again. To some, he became a symbol of German nationalism, the archetype of resistance against empire. A giant statue was built in the 19th century in his honor, the Hermannsdenkmal, where Arminius, or Hermann as he came to be known in Germanic tradition, still towers over the land he once fought to protect. Yet Arminius was not a nationalist in the modern sense. He was not fighting for a flag or a nation state. He fought for freedom, for the right of his people to remain wild, independent, and untamed. He was both Roman and barbarian, a bridge between worlds, and a man who used the empire's own tools to strike it down. Some Roman historians painted him as a traitor. Others, more honest, recognized his brilliance. Tacitus, writing years later, called him undoubtedly the liberator of Germany. But his story is more than just a footnote in the chronicles of war. It is a reminder that even the greatest empires can be humbled not by armies alone, but by the courage of one man who refuses to forget who he is. Tonight, as you close your eyes, remember Arminius, not just the general, not just the rebel, but the child once taken from his homeland, raised in the shadow of the empire, who turned that shadow into fire. He did not live to see his people united. He did not live to see the echoes of his deeds shape centuries of resistance, but he ensured that the forests of Germania would never fall to Rome. And in the silent trees, where armor once clashed and torches once burned, you can still feel his spirit, wild, watchful, and free. In the land of the rising sun, where mountains pierce the clouds and cherry blossoms drift like snow, there once lived a woman whose name echoed through the halls of battle, Tomoe Gozen. In an age when samurai were men and women were expected to serve quietly in the shadows, she emerged like a blade drawn in defiance, bright, sharp, and unforgettable. Her story begins in the late 12th century, during a time of civil war and turmoil in Japan. It was the Genpei War, a brutal conflict between two powerful clans, the Minamoto and the Taira. These wars would reshape the nation and give birth to the samurai code that would define Japanese history for centuries. But in the midst of armored lords and fearsome warriors, one figure stood apart, a woman, clad in full battle armor, riding into combat like a storm. Her name was whispered not with doubt, but with awe, Tomoe Gozen. Gozen, an honorific meaning lady, marked her not just as noble, but formidable. She was more than a warrior. She was a legend made flesh. Described by contemporaries as a woman of remarkable beauty, strong as a man, and skilled in archery and swordsmanship, Tomoe defied every expectation placed upon her. She served under Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a brilliant yet ultimately doomed general of the Minamoto clan. Some claimed she was his concubine, others his bodyguard, and others still his equal in arms. The truth, as with all legends, lies somewhere in between. What cannot be denied is that she fought beside him in battle after battle, not as a decoration, but as a terror on the field. In her most famous battle, the Battle of Owazu in 1184, Tomoe's legend was forged in blood and steel. Yoshinaka, her lord, had grown too ambitious. After defeating the Taira in several key battles, he marched on Kyoto and took the imperial capital for himself. But power in Japan was a fleeting thing, and soon his own cousin, Minamoto no Yoritomo, turned against him. Surrounded and betrayed, Yoshinaka faced his final stand. As his forces crumbled and the snow turned red beneath the hooves of fleeing horses, Tomoe remained by his side. With only a handful of retainers left, Yoshinaka told her to flee. Whether he wished to spare her or feared shame in dying beside a woman, we do not know. But Tomoe did not run. Instead, she turned her steed, rode into the chaos, and challenged one of the enemy's strongest warriors, Onda no Hachiro Morishige of Musashi. She cut him down in single combat, severing his head, then vanished into history. Some say she died on the battlefield, others that she escaped and became a nun, spending her remaining years in quiet contemplation of a world once filled with war. Still others claim she was captured, forced to marry, and lived a life of reluctant peace. But what remains is her legend. In a society bound by the strict codes of Bushido, loyalty, honor, and martial valor, Tomoe stood as both an exception and an embodiment of the samurai ideal. She was not supposed to exist. And yet, she did, not in myths alone, but in scrolls, in songs, and in the fear she struck into the hearts of her enemies. She became more than a warrior. She became a symbol of resistance, of power, and of the quiet rebellion of being excellent in a world that said she could not be. The Heike Monogatari, the epic poem that chronicles the rise and fall of the Taira clan, devotes only a few lines to Tomoe. But those lines burn brighter than most men's entire careers. For in them lives a woman who took the reins of a warhorse, lifted the weight of a katana, and rode into eternity. Her image has been drawn and redrawn in ink, in memory, in firelight retellings, always wearing her armor, always ready to fight. As night falls and the world grows still, think of Tomoe Gozen, not just as a warrior, but as a question. What is strength? Is it the force of an army, the weight of a title, or is it the soul that refuses to yield, even when outnumbered, even when unwelcome? She fought not for glory, not for immortality, but because she could, because she must. And in doing so, she carved her place in a history that tried to forget her. Tonight, sleep with the knowledge that courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it wears a helmet, sometimes it rides alone into a sea of swords, and sometimes it lives in a woman who dared to be a warrior when the world said she could only be a wife. Tomoe Gozen, the forgotten hero who was never truly forgotten. In the deep waters of the East Sea, where the tides roll with ancient memory and the winds whisper through pine covered cliffs, there once sailed a man who defied the impossible. His enemies outnumbered him, his own king betrayed him, and yet he stood, unshaken, undefeated. His name was Yi Sun Sin, and he was the admiral who saved a nation. Born in 1545 in the kingdom of Joseon, what we now know as Korea, Yi Sun Sin came into the world during a time of uneasy peace. He was not born into power, but into duty. From a young age, he showed a deep, disciplined mind, not just for the sword, but for study, strategy, and the rhythm of the sea. He failed the military examination once, injured during the trials, but returned and passed with distinction, not through favor or birthright, but through quiet perseverance. In the 1590s, a shadow began to fall across Joseon. To the east, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Japan's ambitious warlord, looked across the sea with conquest in his eyes. He intended not just to invade Korea, but to use it as a stepping stone to conquer Ming China. In 1592, the Japanese launched a massive invasion, tens of thousands of troops landing in waves, cutting through Korea with brutal speed. Cities fell, the capital was abandoned, the land burned. But the sea still held hope. Yi Sun Sin was appointed as naval commander of the Joseon Left Navy, stationed at a modest base in the southern port of Yosu. He had no grand fleet, no glory behind him, but he had what many did not: a calm mind, an unbreakable will, and an understanding that war is won not only through strength, but through precision. While others panicked, Yi prepared. He trained his sailors, repaired and improved his ships, and studied the tides, islands, and straits with the eye of a master painter studying every stroke. He introduced innovations, the most famous being the Geobuxeon, the turtle ship, an armored warship unlike anything the world had seen. Covered in iron spikes to prevent boarding, armed with cannons on all sides, it moved like a beast through water, silent, strong, and deadly. Then, when the moment came, he struck. At the Battle of Okpo, Yi engaged the Japanese Navy for the first time. With precise maneuvering and relentless cannon fire, he destroyed dozens of enemy ships without losing a single one of his own. It was only the beginning. Over the next few years, Admiral Yi would win every single battle he fought, more than 20 major engagements. Outnumbered time and again, he would use the narrow straits, the deceptive tides, and flawless timing to ambush and overwhelm the enemy. The Battle of Hansen Island became his masterpiece. Luring the Japanese fleet into a trap, Yi deployed a formation he had perfected, the crane wing. His ships spread outward in a sweeping arc, encircling the enemy like a net tightening on its prey. The result was a devastating Korean victory, more than 50 enemy ships destroyed, while Yi's fleet suffered almost no losses. Yet even as he protected his country, politics brewed in the court. Jealous rivals whispered in the king's ear. His success, they claimed, was arrogance. His loyalty was questioned, and then, in a decision still remembered with disbelief, King Seonjo ordered Yi's arrest. Stripped of his rank, tortured, nearly executed, Yi was imprisoned while the war still raged. A less honorable man might have broken. But Yi endured, he kept no bitterness in his heart, and when his replacement led the navy to near total ruin, the king had no choice but to restore the man he had once betrayed. Yi returned, not for revenge, not for glory, but because his people still needed him. In 1597, the Japanese launched a second invasion. Once again, Yi rebuilt the navy from just 12 ships, only 12, against hundreds. At the Battle of Myeongnyang, he lured the enemy fleet into treacherous waters where the currents could snap oars and twist hulls. Stationed at a narrow strait, he waited until the tide turned. Then he attacked. His 12 ships fought against more than 300. By the end of the day, Yi Sun Sin had sunk 31 enemy ships and routed the rest. Not one of his ships was lost. The victory stunned both Korea and Japan. It wasn't just a battle, it was a miracle born of genius, discipline, and indomitable will. Yet the end was near. In 1598, during the final campaign of the war, Yi led the Korean and Ming Chinese fleet to intercept the retreating Japanese navy at the Battle of Noryong. It would be his last battle. As the enemy tried to flee through darkness and chaos, Yi's fleet attacked with overwhelming force. In the midst of victory, a single musket ball, fired from a retreating enemy ship, struck him in the chest. Realizing the danger to morale, Yi whispered his final order: "Do not let the others know I am dead." He died standing. His death was not revealed until the battle was over, and the enemy had fled in complete defeat. Yi Sun Sin died as he had lived, in service, in silence, and in victory. In all his years of command, Yi never lost a single battle, never lost a single ship, and never wavered in his duty, not to kings, but to his country. Today, he is revered as Korea's greatest hero. Statues of him stand tall in Seoul and beyond. His journals, written with humility and insight, remain some of the most treasured documents of Korean history. In Japan, even his former enemies came to respect him as one of the finest naval commanders who ever lived. Admirals from around the world, including Horatio Nelson, have spoken of him with awe. But perhaps his greatest legacy is this: in a time of chaos, when even the throne turned against him, Yi Sun Sin did not give up. He chose principle over power, duty over bitterness, and by doing so, he defended not only a nation, but the very idea that one person, steady and unshaken, can hold back a tide. Tonight, as the waves whisper beyond your window, remember Yi Sun Sin, the admiral who walked alone through betrayal and still carried a nation on his shoulders. May his calm remind you that even in the storm, there is strength in staying true. High above the windswept plains of Central Asia, where the jagged cliffs of the Sogdian Mountains kiss the sky, there stood a fortress so remote, so sheer in its height, that it was said no man could conquer it. Its defenders believed themselves invincible, and for a time they were. This was Sogdian Rock, and though history remembers the name of Alexander the Great, it has forgotten the mountain warriors who defied him and the desperate stand they made at the edge of the world. Let their story now be told. It was the year 327 BCE, Alexander had already carved a path of conquest from the Mediterranean to the Indus. The Persian Empire had crumbled beneath his feet. City after city, kingdom after kingdom had fallen, some by sword, others by submission. But Central Asia proved different. Here, in the highlands of Sogdiana, in what is now parts of modern Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, the land was wild, the people proud, and the resistance fierce. Among them were the Sogdians, a people of traders and warriors, descendants of ancient Aryan tribes known for their courage and independence. When Alexander marched through their valleys, many submitted or fled, but a small group, families, fighters, nobles, and outlaws, took refuge in an ancient mountain stronghold, a towering limestone cliff fortress known only as the Rock. Accessible only by narrow paths and sheer ascents, the Sogdian Rock was more than a fortress. It was a symbol. Here, they believed, the invaders' reach would end. The defenders brought their families, their food stores, and their weapons. From these dizzying heights, they could see the dust of armies far below, but felt no fear. When Alexander approached, he sent messengers demanding their surrender. The reply was swift and mocking. "You will need soldiers who can fly," the Sogdians said, "for no one can climb the rock." It was not an idle boast. The cliffs rose hundreds of feet, their surfaces slick with ice and wind, guarded by narrow ledges and watchful sentries. Even the horses and baggage animals of the Sogdians had been hauled up by ropes. It seemed impossible, but Alexander, famed not just for his power, but for his pride, refused to accept that anything was beyond his reach. And so he gave a terrible order. He summoned his most daring men, volunteers only, and asked the unthinkable to scale the cliffs at night, using iron pegs, ropes, and sheer will. These men were not ordinary soldiers. They were climbers, hunters, mountain-born warriors, used to danger, but even they hesitated. Many would die. Still, 300 men stepped forward. Under the cover of darkness, they began the ascent. The wind howled, ice slicked the rocks, pegs bent or snapped, ropes frayed and fingers bled. More than 30 climbers fell to their deaths, their cries lost to the wind, but the others, silent, grim, determined, pressed on. By dawn, they had reached the summit. When the sun rose, the Sogdian defenders looked up and were stunned. Above them, on the highest cliffs, stood Alexander's men, waving cloth banners and shields. The impossible had happened. The Macedonians had flown. Faced with this miracle and fearing a slaughter, the defenders surrendered. No siege engines, no ladders, no arrows had breached the rock, just raw courage. And yet, as the gates opened, a question hung heavy in the air. Who truly won that day? For all his glory, Alexander spared the defenders, perhaps impressed by their boldness. Among those inside was Roxana, a Sogdian noblewoman of great beauty and intellect. Captured, she would later become Alexander's wife, his only legitimate bride, and the symbolic bridge between the Greek conqueror and the peoples of Central Asia. But let us not drift from the true heroes of this tale, the defenders of the rock. They were not kings. They wrote no histories. They held no great titles. And yet, for one moment, they stood as the final wall against an empire that had already swallowed half the world. They believed in their mountain, their people, and their right to remain free. And when they fell, it was not to swords or fire, but to something even rarer, awe. We do not know their names. Time has washed them away. No monuments mark their graves, but high in the cliffs of Central Asia, the wind still moves through the stone, and the mountains remember. Tonight, as you close your eyes and drift into sleep, think of those silent warriors, families huddled by firelight atop a snowy peak, the sound of hoofbeats in the valley below, and the impossible courage it takes to say, "We will not yield." Though history remembers the conqueror, we remember the defiant, the forgotten, the ones who dared to hold the rock. In the stillness of a Maryland night, under a sky heavy with stars, and the silence of danger, a woman moved through the tall grass. She was small, no taller than 5 feet, dressed in rough homespun clothes. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the shadows, ears tuned to every rustle in the woods. In one hand, she held a lantern. In the other, faith. Her name was Harriet Tubman, and she was leading people to freedom. But before she became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, before she freed hundreds, before her name echoed in the history books, she was simply a child named Araminta, born into slavery. She was born sometime around 1822 on a plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland. Her parents, Harriet Ritt Green and Ben Ross, were enslaved. From the moment she could walk, Araminta, or Minty, worked, checking muskrat traps, hauling water, later plowing fields and chopping wood. There was no childhood, only labor and pain. When she was around 13 years old, she stepped into a store and saw another enslaved man trying to escape. A white overseer demanded she help restrain him. She refused. The man ran. In the chaos, the overseer hurled a 2-pound iron weight, and it struck her in the head. She collapsed. Blood poured down her face. For months, she drifted in and out of consciousness. For the rest of her life, she suffered intense headaches, seizures, and powerful dreams, visions she believed were sent by God. That injury changed her. She began to see herself not just as a survivor, but as someone chosen for a purpose, a voice for the voiceless, a weapon for the oppressed. In her late 20s, she made the hardest decision of her life. She ran. Alone at night, with no map, no food, and a bounty on her head, Harriet Tubman slipped into the woods and began walking north. She followed the North Star, moved through swamps and forests, trusted whispers and hidden signs, a lantern in a window, a song on the wind, a quilt hanging on a line. And somehow, impossibly, she made it. Freedom. She crossed into Pennsylvania, a free state, and for the first time breathed air unclaimed by chains. But peace did not come, because the people she loved, her parents, siblings, nieces, nephews, they were still enslaved. Her heart could not rest while theirs were bound. So she went back, not once, not twice, but over 13 times. Each journey was a miracle of courage. She used aliases, bribed guards, dressed as an old woman, sometimes carried a revolver, not to shoot the enemy, but to ensure no one she led would turn back. "You'll be free or die," she would whisper. There could be no hesitation. She never lost a passenger. Among her rescues were her brothers, her aging parents, and entire families. She moved through backwoods and bayous, always at night, always with danger a breath away. Slave catchers hunted her. The government placed a bounty on her head, but she pressed on because to her, freedom was not just a condition, it was a calling, and yet her work did not stop with the Underground Railroad. When the Civil War broke out, Harriet Tubman offered her skills to the Union. She became a nurse, a scout, and eventually a spy. She led covert missions behind Confederate lines, gathering intelligence, mapping terrain, and even organizing a raid. In 1863, she became the first woman in American history to lead a military operation, the Combahee River Raid in South Carolina. Alongside Union soldiers, she guided boats through mined waters, led them up the river to Confederate plantations, and helped free over 750 enslaved people in a single night. When the war ended, she did not fade away. She fought for women's suffrage, traveled the country giving speeches, and opened her home to the poor and elderly. She received little pay, no pension for her wartime work, and lived in poverty for much of her life. But she never stopped believing. "I never ran my train off the track," she once said, "and I never lost a passenger." Harriet Tubman died in 1913 at roughly 91 years old. In her final moments, surrounded by those she had helped, she reportedly said, "I go to prepare a place for you." Her life remains a testament to what one person, with courage, faith, and fierce love, can do. She was not educated. She could not read or write. She was born into a world that said she was property, but she rewrote the rules. She walked herself to freedom and came back for others. She did not seek glory. She sought justice. She did not need armies. She needed only truth, and in doing so, she became one of the most heroic figures in American history, though history for too long forgot her. Tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and the world falls still, let your thoughts drift back to that lantern in the woods, to the rustling leaves, to the woman moving through darkness, one step at a time, carving a path toward the light. Remember Harriet Tubman, the guide, the soldier, the liberator, the one who walked herself out of bondage and then kept walking until others could too. Sleep well, dear listener, and know that even in the darkest nights, there are those who will rise and walk beside you toward the dawn. In the heart of Bohemia, where rolling hills met stone walled cities, a warrior rose from the ashes of chaos. His name would echo in whispers and war chants, feared by enemies, beloved by his people. He was John Zizka, a man who fought half blind, then fully blind, and yet was never once defeated in battle. To understand his story, you must travel back to the early 15th century, to a world on fire. Europe was in turmoil. The church, once a symbol of unity, had fractured. Corruption bloomed within its ranks. The people of Bohemia, modern day Czechia, had begun to question its power. Among them was a priest named Jan Hus, whose calls for reform would spark a revolution. But when Hus was burned at the stake in 1415 for heresy, something in Bohemia broke. A flame ignited. The commoners, peasants, townspeople, and minor nobles rose up in what would become the Hussite Wars. And it was in this crucible that Žižka emerged. He was not born into glory. He was likely born around 1360 into minor nobility, but much of his early life is cloaked in mystery. He fought in wars as a mercenary, traveled through Poland, possibly served in the court of King Władysław II. He lost one eye in his early years. How, no one knows for certain, but the wound did not slow him. What made Žižka different wasn't just his courage, it was his mind. When the Hussite cause called for warriors, Žižka brought more than a sword. He brought strategy, innovation, and a deep understanding of the psychology of war. He took farmers and miners, men with no training, and turned them into an army that would shake Europe. His most famous weapon wasn't a sword or a cannon, it was a wagon. Žižka pioneered the use of war wagons, armored carts bristling with pikes, muskets, and shields. He used them to create mobile fortresses, formations that could withstand cavalry charges and trap armies 10 times their size. On the battlefield, he moved like a ghost, predicting enemy movements, luring knights into traps, striking and vanishing like smoke. In 1420, at the Battle of Witkov Hill, Žižka and a small force defended Prague against the might of the Holy Roman Emperor's crusading army. Outnumbered many times over, his forces held the hill with sheer determination, clever positioning, and the brutal efficiency of his wagon walls. And they won. The world took notice. But the war would not stop. Again and again, the Catholic powers sent armies into Bohemia to crush the Hussites. Again and again, Žižka met them with fire and thunder and drove them back. Then came the moment that would break a lesser man. In 1421, Žižka was struck in his remaining good eye. He went completely blind. And yet, he continued to lead. Blind, he listened to his commanders, studied the terrain through touch and memory, and directed armies with an almost supernatural sense of space. His soldiers revered him, calling him Žižka of the Chalice, for the religious symbol of the Hussites. He fought with righteousness, but not cruelty. He believed he was defending a faith worth dying for, and, more importantly, worth living for. He never lost a battle. He outmaneuvered crusaders, routed knights, and trained a peasant army to become one of the most feared forces in Europe. His enemies called him a demon. His followers saw him as a prophet. And then, in 1424, while preparing for another campaign, Žižka fell ill. Some say it was the plague, others say it was an infection. He died on October 11th, never seeing the end of the war he helped define. But his legend did not die. It is said that on his deathbed, Žižka asked that his skin be flayed and used to make drums, so that even in death he could still lead his soldiers into battle. Whether that tale is truth or myth, it reflects how deeply he lived in the hearts of his people. Today, his statue towers over Prague, sword raised, gaze unblinking despite the blindness he bore. Jan Žižka was not born a conqueror. He had no royal blood, no great inheritance, no formal training. What he had was vision, not of the eyes, but of the mind, and with that vision, he reshaped warfare, defended a people, and wrote his name across history in steel and defiance. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine a hilltop under moonlight, a line of wagons, shields raised, a blind man standing tall, listening to the wind, sensing the coming storm. And know that courage does not come from sight, but from purpose. Sleep well, dear listener, and remember John Zizka, the general who never lost, even when the world went dark. Across the vast grasslands of Central Asia, where the wind howls like wolves and horses thunder across the earth, lived a warrior whose name struck awe into all who heard it, not just for her heritage, but for her unmatched skill in battle. She was Kutalun, the daughter of generals, the blood of Genghis Khan in her veins, and the strongest warrior of the Mongol Empire, male or female. Her story begins around the year 1260, during the twilight of the Mongol Empire's greatest expansion. Her father was Kaidu Khan, a powerful ruler of the Chagatai Khanate and a direct descendant of Genghis Khan himself. Kaidu was a rival of Kublai Khan, the founder of the Yuan dynasty in China, and led fierce resistance against the centralizing forces of the Mongol court. In this world of politics and war, Kutalun was not raised behind veils and walls like another noble women of her age. She was raised in the saddle, trained from childhood to ride, shoot, and fight, not as a novelty, but as a necessity. The Mongols believed all their children, boys and girls, should learn to survive. But Kutalun went beyond survival. She became a legend. Contemporary accounts describe her as tall, strong, and bold. One story comes from the writings of Marco Polo, who traveled through Asia and heard tales of the Mongol princess who could outride, outshoot, and outwrestle any man who dared challenge her. Wrestling was one of the three manly skills of the Mongols, along with archery and horse racing. It was brutal, raw, and held in sacred honor. Kutalun didn't just compete, she dominated. Her father, impressed and proud, often brought her into battle at his side. Clad in armor, with a bow slung across her back and a sword at her hip, she fought like a lioness among wolves, swift, unrelenting, and terrifying. But Kutalun wasn't only a warrior. She was also a woman of fierce independence. Many suitors came from across the steppe and beyond, seeking to marry her for her beauty, her status, and her power. But Kutalun imposed a condition. Any man who wished to marry her must defeat her in wrestling. If he lost, he would owe her 100 horses. They all lost. Over time, she amassed 10,000 horses, the spoils of male pride, defeated by female might. Her legend grew. Songs were sung of the princess, who could break a man's back before she would break her own heart. Still, not all Mongol nobles appreciated her defiance of tradition, her refusal to marry, her presence in military councils, and her growing popularity made her a target of intrigue and whispers. Some feared she might even succeed her father as ruler, something nearly unthinkable in Mongol politics, despite her lineage. Her father, Qaida Khan, considered naming her as his successor. She was certainly the most capable, but pressure from conservative nobles and the complex politics of the time made it difficult. Eventually, Cuchulainn did marry, but it was on her terms, not through defeat. Some say she married a warrior of her choosing, others claim it was a political alliance. But by then, her legend was already cemented. She continued to fight beside her father until his death in 1301, commanding troops and defending the independence of her family's territory against the Yuan dynasty. After his death, her influence diminished as male rivals jockeyed for control, and history, written mostly by men, began to push her into the shadows. But she was never forgotten. Centuries later, her story would inspire writers and composers. The French opera Turandot by Puccini, though fictionalized and Europeanized, is believed to have been loosely based on Cuchulainn. But the real woman was far greater than myth. She didn't sit in ivory towers giving riddles to princes. She rode into war, stood beside generals, and never bowed to any man. She remains a symbol of strength, courage, and defiance. Tonight, as you rest, imagine the endless Mongolian steppe under starlight. A lone horse gallops through the night, and on its back rides a warrior, hair streaming behind her, bow in hand, fearless. That is Cuchulainn, the princess who fought like 10 men and lived by her own rules. Sleep well, dear listener, and remember, some heroes wear crowns, others wear armor, and never, ever lose. In the year 1565, the might of the Ottoman Empire, the most powerful force on earth, turned its eyes westward toward a small, rocky island in the Mediterranean, Malta. It should have fallen within weeks, but it didn't, because standing between the Ottomans and the conquest of Europe was one man, Jean de la Valette, a warrior monk, a man of iron discipline and unwavering faith, and the Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller. Born in 1494 to a noble family in southern France, La Valette joined the Knights at an early age. The order was a militant brotherhood of warrior monks, guardians of the sick, protectors of pilgrims, and fierce fighters in the name of Christendom. By the time he was 20, La Valette had already begun earning a reputation not just for his piety, but for his courage. He fought in the endless skirmishes that raged across the Mediterranean, from the coast of North Africa to the waters around Greece. In one battle, he was captured by Muslim corsairs and spent a year as a galley slave, rowing under the lash of his enemies. But he never broke. When he was finally freed, he returned not with hatred, but with hardened resolve. By the 1550s, he had risen through the ranks and was elected Grand Master of the Order. Malta, a small island gifted to the knights by Emperor Charles V, had become their last true stronghold after being driven from the Holy Land and Rhodes. Isolated, under-resourced, and poorly fortified, Malta seemed a poor match for the rising storm. That storm came in May of 1565. The Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, still burning from the Knights' raids on his shipping and cities, sent an army to crush them once and for all. The force was immense, some 40,000 men, including elite janissaries, massive siege cannons, and naval fleets. The Knights? barely 700 in number, supported by a few thousand local soldiers and peasants. But Jean de la Valette was unshaken. At over 70 years old, the Grand Master was still a warrior. He personally oversaw every aspect of the island's defense, from reinforcing the crumbling walls of Fort St. Elmo to organizing food and ammunition. He prayed with his men, bled beside them, and refused to hide behind stone or title. The siege began with thunder and flame. Ottoman cannons pounded Fort St. Elmo day and night, turning its walls to rubble. The defenders, led by just 120 knights, held for nearly a month, far longer than the Ottomans had predicted. When the fort finally fell, the defenders had died to the last man. The Ottomans expected surrender. Instead, they were greeted with renewed resistance. La Valette sent word across the fortifications: "We fight not for land or glory, but for our God and our people. There will be no surrender." What followed was one of the most brutal sieges in history. Day after day, waves of Ottoman troops hurled themselves at the defenses. The air was thick with smoke and blood. Walls were blown open, rebuilt overnight, and assaulted again. Disease spread. Food dwindled. Men died by the hundreds. But still, the knights held. La Valette himself fought on the walls, sword in hand. When a shot wounded him, he refused to rest. When morale faltered, he stood tall and spoke of duty, of honor, of faith. He told his soldiers, "If Malta falls, Europe will follow." And he was right. After 3 months, the Ottomans began to falter. Reinforcements arrived from Sicily, and the defenders launched a final, desperate counterattack. The Ottomans, exhausted and demoralized, broke ranks. On September 11th, 1565, they fled the island, leaving behind tens of thousands of dead. Malta had survived. Europe had been saved. La Valette was hailed as a hero across Christendom. The Pope called him the Shield of Europe. A new city was built on Malta's coast and named Valletta in his honor, a fortress city that still stands today. But Jean de la Valette never sought glory. He declined riches, remained in his monk's robes, and spent his final years rebuilding the island he had saved. He died in 1568, buried beneath the walls of the city that bore his name. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, remember the old warrior who stood against an empire with nothing but stone walls, iron will, and an unshakable faith. He asked for no fame, but history gave it to him anyway. Jean de la Valette, the forgotten hero who did not bend, did not break, and did not fall. In the early 20th century, the sun never set on the European empires. Nations like France and Spain carved up Africa with little resistance, or so they thought. But in the rugged mountains of northern Morocco, a man arose who would remind the world that not all peoples submit quietly to conquest. His name was Muhammad ibn Abd al-Karim al-Khattabi, but history remembers him simply as Abd el-Krim. Born in 1882 in the Rif Mountains, Abd el-Krim was the son of a respected Qadi, Islamic judge, of the Ait Warriagar tribe. He was raised in a world of deep tradition, Islamic scholarship, and tribal independence, a world soon to be threatened by colonial ambition. From an early age, he stood out, not only for his fierce intellect, but for his understanding of both traditional Berber culture and modern European systems. He studied theology and law in Fez, then worked for the Spanish administration in Melilla, learning the inner workings of the very colonial system that would soon become his enemy. But it was World War I and its aftermath that changed everything. While Europe lay in ruins, its empires sought to tighten their grip on colonial possessions. In Morocco, Spain and France aimed to pacify the resistant mountain tribes, the Riffians, through military force. They underestimated them. When the Spanish launched a campaign to extend control over the Rif in 1920, Abd el Krim, now in his late 30s, stepped forward. He united the fiercely independent tribes under a common banner. It was a feat no leader before him had achieved. And with this fragile unity, he built what would become a symbol of defiance to imperial rule, the Republic of the Rif, a short lived but extraordinary experiment in self governance, democracy, and national identity. Then came Annual. In 1921, the Spanish army, overconfident and unfamiliar with the terrain, marched deep into the Rif. Abd el Krim laid a trap. In what became one of the greatest colonial defeats in history, the Riffians ambushed and destroyed an entire Spanish army of over 20,000 men. The Battle of Annual sent shockwaves through Europe. Spain lost more soldiers in a single week than in years of war. It was a triumph not just of strategy, but of a people's will. Abd el Krim used the momentum to declare independence, forming the Rif Republic in 1923. It had its own flag, currency, and government. His vision was revolutionary, not just freedom from colonial rule, but a modern, functioning Berber state built on Islamic principles and tribal cooperation. But independence came at a cost. The defeat humiliated the Spanish, and now France, which controlled the rest of Morocco, saw the Rif Republic as a dangerous example. In 1925, both empires joined forces, deploying over 500,000 troops, tanks, heavy artillery, and even chemical weapons against Abd el Krim's forces. It was one of the first times in history that mustard gas was used against civilians. The Riffian resistance fought bravely in caves, mountains, and villages, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and encircled. Knowing further war would mean only the slaughter of his people, Abd el Krim surrendered in 1926, not in defeat, but to save lives. He was exiled to Reunion Island in the Indian Ocean, but even in exile, his legacy grew. In 1947, he escaped house arrest and fled to Egypt, where he was welcomed by pan-Arab leaders like Gamal Abdel Nasser. Until his death in 1963, Abd el Krim remained a symbol of resistance, inspiring freedom movements from Algeria to Vietnam. Even Ho Chi Minh reportedly studied his tactics. He had shown the world that colonial armies could be defeated, that guerrilla resistance, when guided by purpose and unity, could shake even the most powerful empires. He died far from his homeland, never able to return to the Rif. But among his people, he remained a lion, the lion of the Rif, who proved that courage and strategy can hold back the tide of empire if only for a moment. So tonight, as the winds of sleep drift over you, remember the man who turned mountain warriors into a nation. He did not conquer for riches or crown, but to give voice to the forgotten. Abd el Krim, the teacher, the fighter, the builder of a dream that echoed across continents. His republic fell, but his resistance never died. The Roman Empire was vast, a colossus that stretched from the deserts of Egypt to the highlands of Scotland. Its legions were unmatched, its laws unyielding. But in the misty lands of ancient Britain, a woman rose who would shake even Rome to its core. Her name was Boudica, Queen of the Iceni. The year was around 60 CE. The Roman conquest of Britain was underway. The native tribes, proud, diverse, fiercely independent, had resisted, but slowly they were being absorbed, subdued, or broken. Among them, the Iceni, a Celtic tribe in what is now East Anglia, had tried to coexist. Their king, Prasutagus, ruled as a client king, allowed to govern in exchange for loyalty to Rome. When he died, he left his kingdom jointly to his two daughters and to the Roman emperor, hoping to protect his family and people. But Rome did not honor his wishes. The Romans saw the Iceni lands as theirs for the taking. They annexed the territory, confiscated property, enslaved nobles, and, in an act of unspeakable brutality, flogged Boudica publicly and raped her two daughters. It was not just a violation of her family, it was a declaration of dominance. But they did not break her. Instead, Boudica rose like a storm. With fire in her heart and vengeance in her eyes, she called upon the tribes of Britain to rise. The Trinovantes joined her, long resentful of Roman rule, and soon a massive tribal coalition formed, united not by political ambition, but by rage, grief, and a thirst for freedom. They marched on Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, the Roman capital in Britain. The city was poorly defended, and it fell quickly. The rebels burned it to the ground, massacring the Roman settlers and collaborators. No mercy was given. This was not a war for conquest. It was an uprising, a cleansing, a roar from a people who had been silenced. Next came Londinium, London. The Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, fled with his troops, leaving the city defenseless. Boudica's army descended, and again the city was razed. The same fate awaited Verulamium, modern St. Albans. Estimates say 70,000 to 80,000 Romans and allies were killed during her rebellion. The fury of Boudica's vengeance stunned the empire, but Rome does not yield easily. Suetonius regrouped his legions and chose a battlefield wisely, open, narrow, where Boudica's massive numbers would be less effective. The Romans were disciplined, armored, and backed into a corner. They would not run again. The battle was brutal. Though Boudica's forces outnumbered the Romans, discipline and tactics won the day. Thousands of rebels were slaughtered. Some were trapped by their own wagons and cut down without escape. The rebellion was crushed, and Boudica, her fate is debated. Some say she poisoned herself rather than face capture. Others believe she fell in battle. What is certain is that she vanished, and with her, the rebellion died. But her legend was born. Boudica was not just a queen. She became a symbol of resistance, of womanly fury, of a people who dared to say no to empire. Centuries later, during the rise of the British Empire, the Victorians would resurrect her image as a patriotic icon. Her statue still stands near the Houses of Parliament, spear in hand, chariot wheels cutting through history. But beyond the bronze and legend lies something deeper: a mother, a queen, a warrior who, when stripped of everything, rose not to mourn, but to fight. She reminded the world that even the mightiest empire can tremble when a people rise in unity, in grief, and in fury. So as you drift to sleep tonight, remember Boudica, the warrior queen of Britannia, whose spirit still echoes in the mists of time, a reminder that freedom, once burned for, never fades. Long before the chronicles of Europe or the rise of Rome, before swords clashed under banners of known nations, there lived warriors in a land known only to legend. Among them was a man whose name was spoken with awe and reverence: Teancum, the Nephite commander whose blade changed the fate of nations. His story comes from the Book of Mormon, a sacred text revered by millions, yet often unknown outside its followers. But whether viewed as scripture or legend, the tale of Teancum is one of bravery, sacrifice, and unflinching resolve. It was a time of chaos. Two peoples, the Nephites and the Lamanites, were locked in generations of bitter conflict. Empires had risen and fallen in the wilderness of the Americas, and peace was a fleeting dream. Teancum was a military captain under Captain Moroni, the Nephite commander whose leadership held back the Lamanite invasions. Teancum was not just a soldier, he was a weapon, a ghost in the night, a man who struck when others hesitated. His most legendary feat began when the Lamanite king Amalickiah, a treacherous Nephite defector turned conqueror, launched an aggressive war. His ambition was boundless. He sought to crush the Nephites and rule all the land. Teancum knew that the fate of his people could not rest on open battle alone. So, on New Year's Eve, under the cover of darkness and frost, he slipped alone into the enemy camp. Silent as a shadow, he moved past guards, past tents, until he reached the royal pavilion. Inside slept Amalickiah, the king, the traitor, the architect of war. Teancum did not hesitate. He thrust a javelin through the king's heart, ending his life in one swift, surgical strike. He then fled back to his camp, the deed done, the tide of war shaken. The next morning, panic rippled through the Lamanite army. Their king was dead. The Nephites pressed their advantage. It was a turning point, a bold reminder that a single act of courage could alter the path of history. But Teancum's story didn't end there. Amalickiah's brother, Amaron, rose to take the throne and continue the war. Years passed, battles raged, and once again, Teancum found the opportunity to end it all, to finish what he had begun. But this time, something changed. Teancum, weary from war and driven by grief, entered the enemy camp again, alone. His blade found its mark, piercing Amaron's heart. But unlike before, the escape was not clean. The alarm was raised. Guards found him. Tiancum fought with all his strength, but he was surrounded. In the end, he fell, a warrior's death, alone among enemies, his mission completed, his name sealed in legend. His people mourned him deeply. Captain Moroni, his friend and commander, wept over his loss. Tiancum had been more than a soldier. He had been a symbol of resistance, of precision, of honor. He was not reckless. He was strategic. He fought not for glory, but for peace. He gave everything, again and again, not for power, but for the hope that his people might live free of tyranny. Though many question the historicity of his tale, the lesson of Tiancum transcends belief systems. He was a man who risked all, who walked into darkness alone, not once, but twice, because he believed it might end the suffering of thousands. In the grand halls of history, lined with emperors and kings, it is easy to forget the shadow walkers, those who fight in silence, whose victories are won not with armies, but with single, decisive acts. Tiancum was one such man. So tonight, as the world quiets and dreams begin, remember the assassin of kings. Remember the man who crept through enemy camps, not for revenge, but for peace. May his courage whisper to you that sometimes the most powerful battles are fought not in the light of glory, but in the dark, alone, with nothing but purpose as your guide. By day, she was elegance itself, a glamorous Australian socialite, sipping champagne in salons, strolling Parisian boulevards with effortless charm. By night, she became something else entirely, a ghost, a fighter, a leader, a woman hunted by the Gestapo and feared by the Nazis. They called her the White Mouse because they could never catch her. This is the story of Nancy Wake, one of the most decorated Allied agents of World War II. A woman whose courage shook the foundations of Nazi occupied France. Born in New Zealand in 1912 and raised in Australia, Nancy ran away from a difficult childhood and found her future in Europe. In the 1930s, she worked as a journalist and traveled widely, witnessing firsthand the rise of Adolf Hitler. She saw the early signs of fascist brutality and swore, silently, that she would fight it. That vow would define her life. When war broke out in 1939, she was living in Marseille with her French husband, Henri Fiocca. As the Nazis rolled into France, Nancy did not flee. Instead, she joined the French resistance. At first, she worked as a courier, transporting messages, forged documents, and even helping Allied airmen escape across the Pyrenees into Spain. The work was dangerous. Every day she risked arrest, torture, and execution. But she was fearless. She used her charm to slip past guards, flirted her way through checkpoints, and always kept moving. The Gestapo put her on their most wanted list. They never knew her name, only her code name, the White Mouse. By 1943, the pressure became unbearable. The Gestapo had closed in. Nancy had to flee. Traveling through Spain, she made her way to Britain, where she joined the Special Operations Executive, SOE, Churchill's secret army. There, she trained in sabotage, hand-to-hand combat, parachuting, explosives, and guerrilla warfare. She excelled at everything. In 1944, she parachuted into France ahead of D-Day, tasked with uniting resistance groups and preparing them for the Allied invasion. She coordinated attacks on rail lines, communications, and German convoys. She organized weapons drops and trained hundreds of fighters. And when needed, she fought. In one operation, she led a raid on a Gestapo headquarters. In another, she personally executed a German spy with her bare hands when he nearly compromised her unit. During a fierce skirmish in the forest, her team ran out of radio batteries. Nancy biked over 300 kilometers in 72 hours through enemy territory to deliver a message and bring back new equipment. She collapsed from exhaustion, but the mission succeeded. She was relentless. The Germans never caught her, but the war still took from her. Her husband Henri was arrested, tortured, and executed by the Gestapo for refusing to betray her. She only learned the truth after liberation. Despite the loss, Nancy never let grief harden her. After the war, she received countless honors: the George Medal from Britain, the Medal of Freedom from the U.S., and the Legion of Honor from France. But in her later years, she lived simply, often quietly, preferring whiskey over interviews and laughing off suggestions that she had been a hero. "I was just doing my job," she would say. "They had to be stopped." Nancy Wake died in 2011 at the age of 98. To this day, she remains one of the most decorated women in military history. But far more than medals, her legacy is written in the liberation of a people, in the crumbling of tyranny, and in the whispered tales of a woman who danced with danger and never looked away. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Nancy Wake, the white mouse. She ran through shadows, led with fire, and never once let fear dictate her fate. She reminds us that the face of defiance can wear lipstick, carry a pistol, and laugh in the face of fascism. In the 14th century, the Mali Empire stretched across vast reaches of West Africa, from the dense forests of the south to the golden deserts of the north. It was a land of scholars and warriors, merchants and monarchs, united under the banner of one name that echoed across the medieval world: Mansa Musa. Musa is remembered as the richest man to ever live, a pious Muslim emperor whose pilgrimage to Mecca shook the economies of entire regions. But no emperor stands alone. Behind the gold, the libraries, the palaces, there was a sword, a man of strategy and steel. That man was Sagmandia, Musa's trusted general. While Musa shaped the empire with vision and faith, Sagmandia carved its borders with campaigns, swift, calculated, and brutal when needed. His name is barely known outside of a few scattered historical records, but without him, there may have been no Mali Empire as we remember it today. Sagmandia's greatest feat came early in Musa's reign. When Musa ascended to power in the early 1300s, the city of Gao, an important center along the Niger River, resisted his rule. Gao was powerful, a rival kingdom with a proud warrior tradition. But Musa could not afford rebellion on the empire's fringes. He needed a man who could act with precision and strength. He sent Sagmandia. Leading a disciplined force of cavalry and infantry, Sagmandia launched a military campaign into the heart of Gao. The battle was not one of overwhelming force, but of maneuver, surprise, and diplomacy by the blade. Within months, Gao fell. Its princes were brought back to Nayani, the imperial capital, as a symbol of subjugation. It was a turning point. Gao's conquest marked the unification of the Niger River Valley under Musa's rule. It opened the path for expansion, trade, and intellectual flourishing. Timbuktu, the jewel of African scholarship, would soon rise in its shadow, but the sword had done its work. After Gao, Sagmandia led additional campaigns to pacify rebellious provinces and fortify Mali's northern borders. He secured trade routes that fed gold, salt, and knowledge into the empire, and he defended them with unrelenting force. His warriors moved through deserts and forests with quiet precision, never seeking fame, only victory. In the records of Al Umari, a 14th century Arab historian who chronicled Musa's pilgrimage to Cairo, Sagmandia is mentioned only once, described as the general entrusted to command the empire while Musa was away. It was no small responsibility. While Musa dazzled Cairo and Mecca with his wealth, Sagmandia kept the homeland stable. He was more than a soldier. He was a statesman, a guardian, a symbol of discipline in a world of shifting loyalties and fragile alliances. No songs remain of his battles, no great statues were carved in his honor, but perhaps that was his way. Like so many true warriors, Sagmandia fought not for legacy, but for duty. In a world where history often favors emperors, kings, and philosophers, the name Sagmandia whispers from the shadows, a reminder that behind every golden age stands a wall of steel held by those who never ask to be remembered. So, as night falls and sleep draws near, let your dreams wander to the wide rivers of Mali, to the roaring cavalry of West Africa, to a general whose footsteps echoed in sand and silence. Remember Sagmandia, the quiet strength behind the golden throne. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, India was a land under siege, not just from foreign soldiers, but from foreign systems. The British Empire, in its arrogance, imposed its laws, language, and governance across a subcontinent older than any crown. But resistance smoldered in many corners, some in arms, others in words. Among those who chose the power of speech over the sword was Fazlullah Khan, a lesser known but fierce intellectual force who stood against imperial rule not by rebellion in the fields, but by rebellion of the mind. Born in the princely state of Hyderabad, Fazlullah Khan was a product of both Islamic scholarship and British education. He was fluent in Urdu, Arabic, Persian, and of course, English. But rather than be seduced by colonial praise, he used his education as a weapon. He believed that knowledge, rooted in native identity, could awaken a people lulled into submission. Fazlullah rose to prominence in the late 1800s, delivering fiery speeches in local assemblies and writing essays that questioned the morality of empire. His critiques were sharp, surgical, often couched in polite language, but loaded with razor sharp irony. He spoke of the civilizing mission as a farce, challenging the British claim to moral superiority. To Fazlullah, true civilization did not come from Westminster or whitewashed bungalows. It came from centuries of Indian philosophy, art, and theology. But he was not simply a critic, he was a reformer. Fazlullah Khan championed education for all, especially for Muslim youth who had been sidelined by the changing colonial systems. He helped establish local schools and publishing houses, believing that the future of his people depended on reclaiming the power of their own stories. He translated classical Islamic texts into accessible language, bridged gaps between scholars and peasants, and emphasized unity across religious lines. He warned against sectarianism, a tool often used by colonial rulers to divide and rule. For Fazlullah, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, and Christian were all part of a greater Indian soul yearning to be free. But his words, though peaceful, were dangerous. British authorities monitored him closely. His writings were censored. His public lectures were restricted. Yet he never incited violence. His revolution was quieter, but no less powerful. By the early 1900s, Fazlullah had become a mentor to younger activists and thinkers. Though his name never reached the global spotlight like Gandhi or Nehru, his fingerprints were on the minds of those who would lead the charge in decades to come. He passed away in relative obscurity, no grand funeral, no monuments. But he left behind a generation more awake, more alert, and more willing to question the empire that had claimed dominion over their land and minds. Fazlullah Khan may be absent from most textbooks, but his voice, wise, sharp, and defiantly calm, still echoes in the dusty libraries of Hyderabad, in the ink of forgotten pamphlets, and in the hearts of those who believe that freedom begins with thought. So tonight, as you rest, remember that not all heroes charge into battle. Some stand at podiums, pens in hand, voices steady, daring to speak truth to power when it was neither safe nor popular to do so. Fazlullah Khan, the scholar who saw that resistance begins not with rage, but with clarity. In the early 1940s, as Adolf Hitler's grip on Germany tightened and World War II raged across Europe, few dared to challenge the Nazi regime. Speaking out meant prison, or worse. The Gestapo watched everything. Neighbors turned in neighbors. Fear lived in every corner. And yet, in the city of Munich, a group of students did the unthinkable. They fought back, not with guns, but with words. At the heart of this resistance was Sophie Scholl, a 21-year-old philosophy student at the University of Munich. Blonde, bright-eyed, and thoughtful, Sophie did not look like a threat to the Third Reich, but her pen, her mind, and her moral fire made her one of Hitler's most unlikely enemies. Born in 1921 in a small German town, Sophie grew up in a family that valued free thought and morality. Her father, a liberal who openly criticized the Nazis, taught his children to question authority. But like many youth of the time, Sophie joined the League of German Girls, the female branch of the Hitler Youth. It didn't take long for her to see the truth beneath the uniforms and flags. By 1942, She and her older brother Hans joined a secret student resistance group called Die Weiße Rose, the White Rose. Its mission: awaken the German people from their hypnotic submission. Its method: anonymous leaflets. These leaflets, carefully written and distributed by hand, condemned Nazi atrocities, especially the mass murder of Jews, and called for passive resistance. They quoted philosophy, scripture, and even Goethe. They asked Germans to think for themselves, to reject evil disguised as patriotism. Sophie quickly became one of the group's most active members. She helped distribute the leaflets, sometimes leaving them in phone booths, mailboxes, or lecture halls. She believed, as did the group, that the German people were not inherently evil, just misled, afraid, or silent. The White Rose sought to reignite moral clarity in a nation drowning in lies. But courage has a cost. On February 18th, 1943, Sophie and Hans carried a stack of leaflets to the university. After quietly placing them around the atrium, Sophie did something bold, perhaps fateful. From the top floor, she tossed the remaining leaflets into the air, letting them flutter down like snowflakes of protest. A janitor, a loyal Nazi, saw it happen. He called the Gestapo. Sophie and Hans were arrested the same day. They were interrogated for days. Sophie never broke. When offered a chance to recant in exchange for leniency, she refused. Her words were calm, unwavering. Somebody, after all, had to make a start. What we wrote and said is what many people are thinking. They just don't dare to say it out loud. On February 22nd, after a show trial that lasted only a few hours, Sophie, Hans, and their friend Christoph Probst were sentenced to death. That afternoon, they were guillotined. Sophie's last words, spoken with grace and strength, were, "Such a fine, sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" Her execution shocked even some within the Nazi judiciary. But the regime wanted silence, and Sophie had been far too loud. Yet silence would not come. The White Rose leaflets were smuggled out of Germany, copied by the Allies, and dropped over German cities by the millions. What began as the work of a few students became a symbol of inner resistance, a whisper of truth carried by wind and war. Today, Sophie Scholl is remembered not just as a martyr, but as a moral compass, proof that even in a society saturated with hate and fear, one voice, raised clearly and without hate, can still challenge tyranny. So, as you drift into sleep tonight, remember the flutter of paper in a university atrium, the quiet courage of a student, and the eternal weight of one young woman's stand for truth. Sophie Scholl, a rose that bloomed in the darkest of gardens. Born into aristocracy on November 13th, 1806, in the city of Vilnius, then part of the Russian Empire, Amelia Plater was never meant for the battlefield. Her life should have been filled with balls, books, and the duties of a well-bred Polish-Lithuanian noblewoman. But the world she lived in was not kind to dreamers or patriots. By the time Amelia came of age, her homeland was no longer its own. Poland had been partitioned, sliced apart by imperial powers. Austria, Prussia, and Russia until its name was erased from maps, but not from memory. Raised on tales of Polish glory and Lithuanian resistance, Amelia grew restless in a world that expected her to remain silent and composed. She read voraciously Byron, Mickiewicz, and stories of Joan of Arc. These were not simply books to her, they were summons. When the November uprising of 1830 broke out, a revolt by Polish officers against Russian rule, Amelia's heart ignited. Though the uprising began in Warsaw, its spirit spread quickly across the former lands of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. For Amelia, it was no longer a matter of ideals, it was a call to arms. Disguising herself in a military uniform, she cut her long hair and formed her own unit of partisans. Some mocked her at first, a woman pretending to be a soldier, but those doubts vanished as she led men into real battles, including the skirmish at Šiauliai in present-day Lithuania. She fought with sword in hand, galloping on horseback, not as a figurehead, but as a commander. Her courage was not theatrical, it was hard, determined, and unflinching. Reports speak of her discipline, charisma, and endurance, earning the respect of both peasants and officers. She marched through forests in brutal cold, refused to ride when her soldiers had to walk, and shared their food and dangers alike. One officer remarked, "She was more soldier than many men I knew." But heroism does not always conquer history. Despite early victories, the uprising began to falter. Russian forces, better equipped and brutally efficient, regained control. Amelia's unit was eventually cornered. She refused to surrender and attempted to reach Warsaw, hoping to rekindle the fight. But exhaustion and illness took their toll. In late 1831, just months after her final march, Amelia Plater died of illness in a village near Daugavpils. She was 25 years old. Her dream of a free homeland would not be realized in her lifetime, and yet her death did not silence her. She became a symbol of resistance, a Polish Joan of Arc. Romantic poets immortalized her, her uniform preserved in paintings and legend. In the decades that followed, as Poland and Lithuania endured further oppression, Amelia's story was told again and again, whispered in secret schools, sung in forbidden songs, and remembered by rebels who would rise in later generations. Today, she stands not just as a national heroine, but as a timeless reminder that valor has no gender and that noble birth means little without noble action. So tonight, as the stars rise above silent fields and forests, think of a young woman in a soldier's coat, sword drawn, eyes fixed on freedom, a countess who chose not a life of luxury, but a legacy of courage. Amelia Plater, the noble soul who fought like fire. Born in 1919 in Lynchburg, Virginia, Desmond Doss grew up in a strict Seventh-day Adventist household. His faith shaped him deeply. He observed the Sabbath, avoided meat, and clung to the Ten Commandments, especially the one that said, "Thou shalt not kill." But as the world was torn apart by war, Desmond made a choice that shocked both his community and the military. He volunteered to serve in the U.S. Army, yet he would not carry a gun. This decision wasn't taken lightly. In a time when patriotism was measured in firepower, Doss's stance was viewed with suspicion, even hostility. His fellow soldiers mocked him. Some called him a coward. Others beat him. His commanding officers tried to have him discharged as mentally unfit. But Doss refused to quit. He wasn't afraid to fight. He was afraid to kill. Instead, he trained as a combat medic, vowing to go wherever the wounded needed him, and to do so without ever firing a shot. That promise was tested on the blood soaked cliffs of Okinawa in the spring of 1945 on a battlefield known as Hacksaw Ridge. The ridge was a jagged escarpment, heavily fortified by Japanese troops. When Doss's unit scaled its face, they were met with a hellish onslaught. Mortar fire, machine guns, and grenades turned the ridge into a slaughterhouse. The U.S. troops were ordered to retreat, but Desmond Doss stayed behind. Alone, under constant fire, he crawled from body to body, dragging wounded soldiers to the edge of the cliff, tying them in ropes and lowering them one by one to safety. He had no gun, no cover, only his determination and a quiet prayer. Lord, help me get one more. Over the course of 12 hours, Doss saved at least 75 men. Some estimates say more. He carried men on his back, used pieces of wreckage as stretchers, and refused to leave even when shrapnel tore through his leg and arm. For this, he became the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military award. President Harry S. Truman placed the medal around his neck and said, "I consider this a greater honor than being president." After the war, Desmond Doss returned home. He suffered lifelong injuries from his time in combat, but never once regretted his decision to serve without killing. He lived quietly, tending to his garden and his faith, never seeking fame. In 2006, he passed away at the age of 87. His story was eventually brought to the world in books and film, most famously in the movie Hacksaw Ridge, which captured the raw terror of war and the calm heroism of a man who healed instead of harmed. But Desmond's legacy is not just cinematic, it is deeply human. He showed that courage does not always roar, and that conviction can shine brighter than violence. In a war defined by destruction, Doss became a symbol of compassion, the man who stood between death and the fallen without ever striking a blow. So, as you drift toward sleep tonight, imagine a battlefield, silent now, and the figure of a man crawling through smoke and ruin, whispering one simple prayer into the chaos: Lord, help me get one more. Desmond Doss, the soldier who fought without a weapon and won. Born in 1145 in the city of Mosul in modern day Iraq, Abu al-Mahassin Yusuf ibn Rafi ibn Shaddad, known to history as Baha ad-Din, was never destined for the battlefield. From a young age, he showed a deep devotion to learning, memorizing the Quran, studying Islamic law, and mastering Arabic literature and rhetoric. He studied at the famed Nizamiya School of Baghdad, one of the leading centers of scholarship in the Islamic world. There, his brilliance in Sharia law and ethics earned him renown not as a warrior, but as a Qadi, a judge and interpreter of divine justice. But the tides of his life would change when he crossed paths with one of the greatest figures of the age, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known as Saladin. At the time, Saladin was engaged in a monumental struggle, uniting the fractured Muslim world and reclaiming the Holy Land from the Crusaders. But even the greatest of rulers need more than warriors. They need trust, truth, and judgment. In Baha ad-Din, Saladin found all three. In 1188, Baha ad-Din was appointed as a personal advisor and biographer to Saladin. He would go on to serve at Saladin's side in some of the most critical moments of the Crusades, not just observing history, but shaping it. He wasn't a general, he didn't command troops, but he counseled kings, settled disputes, and ensured that Islamic law was upheld even amid the chaos of war. And while the swords clashed, Baha ad-Din wrote. His most important work, Al-Nawadir al-Sultaniya wal-Mahasin al-Yusufiyya, rare and excellent deeds of the Sultan Saladin, remains one of the most detailed and trusted historical accounts of Saladin's campaigns, written not as dry record keeping, but with insight, humanity, and spiritual reflection. Through his words, we see Saladin not just as a military hero, but as a man, tired, compassionate, pious, occasionally stern, but always driven by a vision greater than himself. Baha ad-Din described not only battles, but acts of mercy, such as Saladin's treatment of Christian prisoners and his decision to spare Jerusalem's citizens after retaking the city in 1187, a moment that stunned the Western world. He also negotiated with Crusader leaders, including Richard the Lionheart, and played a key role in brokering truces and prisoner exchanges. While knights sharpened blades, Baha ad-Din wielded diplomacy and helped to humanize the conflict, reminding all sides of the power of justice over vengeance. His writings would go on to influence both Muslim and Christian historians. Without him, the story of Saladin and the Crusades would be far poorer, clouded in myth rather than shaped by memory. After Saladin's death in 1193, Baha ad-Din continued to serve as a judge and scholar in Aleppo, living a life of dignity and quiet influence until his own death in 1234. He never led armies, he never conquered lands, but he preserved a legacy, gave voice to a generation, and stood as a witness to both the glory and the tragedy of war. In Baha ad-Din, we see the power of intellect in an age of swords, the reminder that not all heroes charge into battle. Some sit beside kings, write in candlelight, and ensure that history remembers not only what was done, but why it mattered. So tonight, as pages turn quietly in the library of time, remember the scholar in Saladin's court, the man who stood beside greatness, not for glory, but for truth. Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, the pen that made legend immortal.